Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Merci beaucoup d'être présents pour cet événement, pour pouvoir discuter tous ensemble de la notion d'écocide et comment est-ce qu'on peut mettre au service cette notion de crime d'écocide pour l'océan. Alors on est désolé, il y a des camarades qui vont arriver au cours de cette conférence parce qu'il y a eu un petit problème d'accréditation, mais on sera plus nombreux bientôt. Mais en tout cas, c'est important pour nous de discuter du crime d'écocide et de comment on peut le mettre au service de l'océan, parce que l'océan est très souvent le parent pauvre des politiques environnementales, des politiques écologiques. On parle beaucoup du poumon vert de la forêt, notamment de l'Amazonie, et on commence à peine à prendre au sérieux le rôle de l'océan en tant que poumon bleu, mais pas seulement, parce qu'on le dit très souvent, on doit une respiration sur 2 à l'océan grâce au phytoplancton, mais c'est aussi un puits de carbone, puisque 30% des émissions de gaz à effet de serre générées par l'humain se fait grâce à l'océan. C'est aussi un organe qui régule les excès de chaleur, etc. Donc l'océan nous rend énormément de rôles écosystémiques, mais nous on considère qu'il faut aussi protéger l'océan en tant que tel pour les habitants de l'océan eux-mêmes, parce que l'océan est aussi une source d'émerveillement infini. Il y a beaucoup de personnes qui regardent l'espace pour se sentir tout petit. Moi je trouve qu'il suffit de regarder l'océan, de regarder les baleines pour se sentir petit et insignifiant, et donc l'océan nous apprend aussi l'humilité, même si c'est pas la direction que l'on prend actuellement, parce qu'on est à l'ère qu'on peut appeler celle du capitalocène, où en fait le capitalisme détruit absolument tout sur la planète pour faire du profit à court terme, et au mépris justement de l'habitat qui est le seul compatible avec la vie humaine. Je parle évidemment de la planète Terre, on l'appelle souvent la planète Terre, mais en réalité on pourrait dire la planète bleue, puisque 71% de la surface de l'océan, enfin de la Terre, c'est l'océan. Et voilà, on dit que la vie sur Terre est apparue il y a 3,8 milliards d'années, mais en réalité pendant plus de 3 milliards d'années, la seule vie qui était possible sur Terre se faisait dans l'océan. Donc nous venons littéralement de l'océan, et il est grand temps de se reconnecter justement à cet organe géant qui justement en fait est notre support pour la vie sur Terre. Et donc, on pense que le crime d'écocide, cette notion, peut être mis au service de la protection de l'océan. Et on est ici justement dans la capitale de la Belgique, à Bruxelles. Et on peut considérer que Bruxelles est pionniers en la matière, puisqu'ils ont récemment reconnu dans leur code pénal la notion de crime d'écocide, et donc ça doit inspirer les autres États justement à mettre en place ce type de politique, et ça permettrait aussi de renverser la tendance, parce qu'aujourd'hui ceux qui sont criminalisés, ce sont ceux qui défendent l'environnement, et donc nous on dit qu'il est temps de criminaliser ceux qui détruisent l'environnement. On a un homme qui disait souvent si l'océan meurt, nous mourrons avec lui. Cet homme est actuellement en prison pour avoir sauvé des baleines, et donc avec le crime d'écocide, on peut justement mettre du doigt sur les vrais responsables, sur les vrais criminels ici sur cette planète, qui sont les entreprises écocidaires qui justement font du bénéfice, comme je l'ai dit, au mépris de la vie humaine, mais aussi au mépris des autres formes d'existence qui peuplent notre planète. Donc on est aujourd'hui entouré de personnes expertes qui pourront nous parler plus en détail de comment le crime d'écocide va permettre justement d'avoir un corpus à la fois législatif et judiciaire pour pouvoir justement faire en sorte aussi de prévenir le crime d'écocide, faire en sorte que ce soit suffisamment dissuasif de détruire la planète pour que justement on n'ait pas seulement à réparer, mais qu'on puisse éviter justement toute la destruction de la planète, et notamment de l'océan, parce qu'on a eu un rassemblement place du Luxembourg là, contre le deep sea mining, et en fait c'est très révélateur, parce qu'on voit qu'aujourd'hui on détruit plus facilement que ce qu'on est capable justement d'étudier et de découvrir, parce que quand on parle des fonds marins, c'est justement des endroits en fait qu'on ne connaît pas du tout, et on investit plus facilement pour détruire ces endroits que pour justement étudier, pour faire des recherches scientifiques, pour découvrir tout simplement les espèces qui y sont. Et donc voilà, on est à un rythme effréné de disparition des espèces. Et le crime d'écocide nous permettrait justement de lutter contre ça. Donc là, sans plus attendre, je vais passer la parole à ma collègue Isabella Lövin, qui est également députée ici au Parlement européen, pour poursuivre la discussion.
Thank you so much, Emma, and a pleasure to see so many people here, and still even more arriving. And so glad to see you all here, and happy that the arrangements with the accreditation seem to have been solved. So you're so very, very welcome, and we will continue with me saying a few words. So first of all, I think it's splendid that we have this Ocean Week this week, and that there's so much attention to the ocean. As Emma just said, the ocean is a prerequisite for all life on Earth. So if we continue the way that we've been doing the last 100 years or so, we are completely mistreating the fundamental condition for all life on Earth, and that can't continue. So I'm very happy also that the president-elect, Ursula von der Leyen has announced that there should be an ocean pact during this mandate, and that puts the ocean very high on the political agenda during these 5 years. And we are many MEPs and many stakeholders, civil organizations and others that are really, really pushing for an ambitious ocean pact to make our oceans recover again, because they're in a very bad state. Lately, the last 5-6 years, there's been a lot of action on the global level when it comes to managing and conserving our oceans. We finally have an agreement at the UN on areas beyond national jurisdiction, and to create a tool to protect the biodiversity that is not in any single country's economic zone, but on the huge area, which is the responsibility of all countries and all people, and actually belongs to everyone. So this was a huge step forward and a good one, and has also put the ocean health in the media attention and in people's attention. Of course, the agreement on conserving biodiversity that was took in Montreal on setting up 30% of protected areas, both on land and oceans, by 2030, so 30 by 30, is also a very, very important decision that also needs to be implemented, and all this has to be done also at the European Union level. One very important thing will be also to make sure that oceans will not be limited only to the new, designated Oceans Commissioner, Fisheries and Ocean Commissioner, that has to be also approved by this Parliament, but must also be the concern of many commissioners' portfolios, to make sure that we have a holistic approach and really take seriously all the threats to our ocean. It's not only about potential overfishing, it's not only about the activities at sea, but there's also a lot of activities on land that are affecting the oceans, such as agriculture, forestry, pollution, and we know our oceans are unfortunately in an extremely dire place today, with the climate crisis, where the oceans have absorbed more than 90% of the heat that we as humans have caused due to our use of fossil fuels and other destructive management of land. The ocean has also become much more acidic due to carbon emissions, because the ocean is absorbing that carbon. And we also have eutrophication, we have plastic pollution, we have overfishing, and if we combine all this, or you all heard maybe the prediction that we will have more plastic than fish in our oceans by 2050. Talking about ecocide, what is that? So do we all accept this development or this trend, where we're going? I think that's the core of the whole idea about making ecocide a crime, because all crime is based on the notion that we as a society, we feel that something is not acceptable. But many of the things that are threatening our ocean to this day are still legal or accepted. And that is also, I think, a very important issue to struggle with. where should we put our levels of acceptance. For instance, bottom trawling, we know that it destroys the entire seafloor, and it has consequences for not only 1 year, but for many, many years. Once you've dragged a bottom trawl once in an area, it takes decades for it to recover, but it affects the entire ecosystem. And this is something that is still legal, but is it accepted? I mean, and this is an important topic to discuss. So I'm also, just to finish, to say that I'm excited by the fact that 3 countries, Vanuatu, Fiji and Samoa, formally now has put forward ecocide as a crime to the ICC for consideration. So there's movement at a very high level. So then we will hear from our legal experts what that means, but I think it's a good step forward to really have the moral and legal boundaries of what can we accept as a global community, what is acceptable levels of environmental destruction and not. And with that, I'd just like to hand over to our moderator, Simon Holmström, and thank you for arranging all this. So the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, both to Emma and Isabella, for your insightful opening, setting the scene for today's discussion. I'm Simon Holmström. I'm working at Seas at Risk, which is one of the organizers of today's event, together with Gallifrey Foundation and also Stop Ecocide International. Really happy to see you here. There will probably come a little bit more people after the last round of accredited people are admitted to the Parliament. Sorry for that again. This is a very interesting discussion happening within the scope of Ocean Week, which is organized by a lot of other organizations as well, apart from Seas at Risk, also Oceana, WWF, BirdLife, Client Earth, Surf Rider. And it is a very, very momentous time when we're really putting the ocean at the heart of European policy making. Ecocide, what sets it apart from other environmental harm is the seriousness. Ecocide is about destruction so vast that it threatens the very life support system of our planet. And life support system was just what Emma said. The ocean is one of our largest life support systems. But for decades, we've witnessed catastrophic events of unchecked environmental exploitation. So we're working on different fields, different policy areas, and always talking about incremental changes in those policy areas. So the question we are exploring today is whether an overarching measure, such as ecocide, recognizing ecocide as an international crime, could be the help that the ocean needs. The idea of criminalizing ecocide has gained great momentum recently. It's not a new word, not at all, but it has become more evident that existing environmental laws, while important, often fail to provide sufficient deterrence for large-scale harm. So introducing this concept of ecocide as an international crime could change just this situation. It would mean that holding individuals, corporations, governments accountable for actions that cause severe damage to the environment, and we will hear more about the exact definition of that. However, ecocide is not yet an international crime. It exists in some of the countries, including Belgium, indeed. But that can actually also change very soon, as the EU Environmental Crimes Directive, which has been passed by this Parliament, states that there is, it's not just ecocide, it doesn't call ecocide in the legislation, but there's a concept called qualified offences that member states need to transpose in their own legislations. And they have a little bit of time to do that. So this is also a good discussion to inform of that possibility of strengthening their penal codes to also encompass environmental crimes. And as Isabella said, today's discussion comes very timely, as there is a proposal for a change of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, ICC, put forward by these countries. And as Europe makes a large proportion of members of the ICC, this is also a great debate to follow for those countries, I would say. About myself a bit, I've served as an MP in the Green Party in the Nordic Parliament. I've been driving ecocide as an issue in the Nordic Council myself. Been part of the Ecocide Alliance, a lot of MPs on different levels working to criminalize ecocide. And now I serve as a deep sea mining policy officer at Seas at Risk, representing over 30 NGOs in environmental and in ocean conservancy. But enough about me. This is all about you in the panel. So to kick off this conversation, I'm pleased to introduce our esteemed panelists. I'll give you a maximum 4 minutes each for introduction. And first off, Sue Miller, perhaps, Head of Global Networks for Stop Ecocide International, working with the core team. Sue's key role is to stimulate the conversation around ecocide in as many areas and communities as possible. You have been working before as a lawyer and also in larger law firms or marketing and communications. So the question, Sue, that I would like to pose to you is, could you tell us about the concept of ecocide, how to define it really? Because not everything is ecocide, obviously, and how the Environmental Crimes Directive that the Parliament has passed, and together with the other lawmakers, how that could help include a clearer definition on ecocide in the national transpositions. Yeah. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
You can just put. Yeah. There we
Thank you. Well, as far as ecocide is concerned, I think it's one of the most exciting developments in the environmental law space at the moment, because it's going to protect the earth, and obviously that includes the ocean, against the most serious harms by creating, as both Simon and Isabella have said, personal criminal liability for the individuals behind the worst environmental crimes. So why do we need it? We've got laws that protect the ocean already. We've got various treaties and charters. We've got the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, the Global Biodiversity Framework, the BBNJ, once it's ratified, will be coming in. But the truth is, the ocean is still under a lot of stress and pressure. And the problem is that the protections are fragmentary, and they cover specific issues or geographical areas, and in many cases they lack any effective means of enforcement, and they in effect rely on the will of those in positions of power in order to succeed. And as we can see, that doesn't necessarily work. Now, for the businesses which are causing the damage, there's very little incentive to stop. They're very unlikely to get caught. The profits are too great, and the sanctions, if they are caught, are too weak. So a corporation that finds itself called to account for environmental damages might be ordered to pay a fine or some civil damages, but it's a monetary penalty, and that can be put on a balance sheet as a business expense, and it can be budgeted for. So we need something else. We need something that's going to help strengthen the existing frameworks, and it's also going to help steer us towards working in harmony rather than in conflict with nature, and in particular, the ocean. The good news is that there is something, and that's ecocide law. That's what we're here to discuss. And it will, by creating this personal liability, change the way that decisions are taken in the boardrooms of the world. And it will create a huge incentive for businesses and governments to find better, healthier, more sustainable ways of operating. And the better news is that ecocide law is on its way. So as you've already heard, there was a proposal by Vanuatu, Fiji and Samoa to the International Criminal Court for the member states to consider including ecocide as a new crime to sit alongside genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes and crimes of aggression as the fifth crime against peace, the so-called crimes against peace. The definition that was submitted to the ICC was formulated by an independent expert panel of international lawyers from around the world, convened by our sister organisation, Stop Ecocide Foundation. And the definition is this: unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there is a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by those acts. And that definition, although it's very elegant and concise, each word is very measured and has its own legal reflection in other treaties or some legal legacy behind it. So following the launch of the definition in June 2021, something like 37 countries have now had conversations at parliamentary or governmental level about ecocide law. Some individual states, am I okay for time? Have gone even further. There's a lot to say. And are considering creating their own domestic ecocide laws. Belgium was the first to include it in its penal code. The Netherlands, Italy, Mexico, Brazil, Peru have all got live ecocide bills going through their legislature. More in the pipeline. Scotland had a consultation recently to bring it into the Scots law under devolved authority. And very significantly early this year, the European Union revised its Environmental Crimes Directive and brought in this new qualified offence of crimes comparable to ecocide. That means by May 2026, 25 countries need to transpose that directive, including ecocide level crimes, into their domestic legislature. Now, the directive it differs from the IEP in several respects. In particular, it lists potential offences. Now, when the IEP definition was being drafted, the lawyers particularly wanted to avoid lists because it's very easy to find gaps in lists. So they created a threshold of gravity. So it depends on the seriousness of the crime, not the nature of the crime. So as the EU member states start applying themselves to the transposition of the directive into their legal systems, we at Stop Ecocide International are seeking to work with NGOs, parliamentarians across Europe to try and encourage them to use the directive just as a baseline and to bring a more ambitious version of ecocide law into their domestic legislatures, because that is just a minimum to which they must all adhere. So a vibrant conversation around ecocide in Europe is really important for this more ambitious transposition, but also it's going to stimulate and advance the international conversation, and it's going to help ensure that ecocide is ultimately enshrined at the ICC, because that's the measure that's going to throw a safety blanket around the whole earth, and in so doing, protect our ocean. Thank you. Sorry if I overran.
Thank you so much. A round of applause for that. And the next speaker would be you, Isabella. You have served as a Green Minister between 2014 and 21, including Deputy Prime Minister in Sweden, an author, a journalist by profession. You served as an MEP before in the Parliament as well between 2009 and 14, with fishery issues as core focus. Now you're back, still with the same core focus. Isabella, you talked about acceptability as one of the things that Ecocide is really opening up a discussion about, and you also talked about the Ocean Pact. Could you tell us a little bit more what you're thinking? How could Ecocide be a part of coming Ocean Pact that the Commission will be developing?
Thank you very much, Simon. That remains to be seen, but I think at a fundamental level, the ocean, as I said in the beginning, the ocean belongs to all of us. It covers 2/3 of this planet's surface, and it's more than 90% of all life on Earth is in the ocean. 2/3 rather of all the ocean is international waters. So, and they are now extremely affected by what we as humans have done over the last 100 or 150 years. So it's really our responsibility to take this seriously and make sure that we have measures that make the ocean recover. But one kind of problem in the way is that we have this kind of mental idea that the ocean, since it doesn't belong to anyone, you can do whatever you want with it. For a long, long time, you kind of considered the international waters as mare liberum, so it's free for all. I once heard someone say, we have met Gianni here also, we've been working on illegal fisheries or preventing illegal fisheries, but someone defined illegal fisheries as a crime without a victim. That is, if you just grab the fish, well, who will complain? And who's the victim? The fish? Probably. But also, I think we need to recognize that the victim is all the local communities, those that fish legally, future generations that are being deprived of their right to a healthy ocean, and the ocean as such. Because the ocean also, I believe, in fact, has some rights. And we live in a legal kind of universe where the only ones that have rights are individuals, people, countries in some cases, and businesses. They also have legal rights. But the ocean doesn't have any right. A fish stock does not have any right. So these are also concepts that I am also thinking a lot about and elaborating on. In order for us to change behavior, we must feel that there is a victim. There is someone who has a right to a healthy ocean or even a healthy planet. In Sweden, we have a law that says that if you throw a cigarette butt on the street, there will be a fine, 80 euros for one cigarette butt. But there's no fine if you just emit 1 ton of CO2. That's considered normal. Even if you have alternatives that you could use, but no, you can argue that, no, that would be inconvenient for me, or it would be too expensive. So that's the way we're thinking right now. And the same goes for bottom trawling, as I said recently, that I said earlier. So bottom trawling is one method of fishing, but there's other methods that you can also fish with, static gear or pods or cages or whatever. You can also, but we're still kind of accepting the fact that this is the only way that you can do things, and therefore you just continue doing it. But of course, if we see that there is a responsibility for everyone to protect and treat the nature and the ocean, particularly since we're talking about that now, with respect, then I think we could really push the agenda forward. The difference here, because you mentioned all the other pieces of legislation that we have, so just to introduce such an idea as ecocide is also giving kind of the moral strength to the idea that it's not okay to destroy the nature. And it's as simple as that. If you don't have any kind of moral agreement or a legal agreement on that, people will continue to do it. And we have to, I mean, it's the same thing with the cigarette butt law or the small litter law that we have in Sweden. So everyone stopped just throwing it on the street. As simple as that, because it's not allowed. So as long as something is allowed, people will continue doing it. So stop to see environmental destruction as victimless crimes, because they're not. And we just have to also, as you mentioned, make sure that those that consciously are pursuing practices that destroy in a large scale the environment will be held accountable. And I think also that will change the way that businesses will invest and what practices are allowed, because then you will risk actually being fined or even being taken to prison if that's serious enough. So it is a change of mindset, I think, primarily. And it will be very interesting to see how member states will implement this in their national laws, because it's not really clear to me yet what it will mean with the qualified crime, but we will follow this very closely, and I look forward to this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I will come back to the question on Ocean Pact in the discussion later on. Yeah. But as you also posed a question or mentioned Matt, I think it's time for you now to explain a little bit on the fisheries aspect. Matt is an independent consultant in marine conservation. You've been working for 3 decades, I think, with various topics ranging from policy law, treaty negotiations on fisheries, deep sea mining and others. You co-founded the Global Deep Sea Conservation Coalition, and you are still serving as a political and policy advisor, contributing to key discussions at the UN, FOA, the ISA, International Seabed Authority and others. So I would like you to talk just about this, the victimless crimes, and about deep sea fisheries, drawing from your experience. How do you think that criminalization of ecocide could deter the most harmful practices to the ocean in this respect?
Yeah, thank you, Simon, and appreciate the opportunity to speak and to be here participating in this panel discussion. I've been aware of the development of the ecocide principles and so forth for a while now, and am personally a strong supporter. The Deep Sea Conservation Coalition is a coalition of over 130 organizations worldwide. We started it in 2004 to take the issue of bottom trawl fishing on the high seas to the United Nations General Assembly to try to get a moratorium on this practice to protect deep sea ecosystems, and in particular, seamounts and oceanic ridge systems. These are some of the most biologically diverse areas of the world's oceans. And one of the motivating factors was warnings being raised by scientists, including Dr. Fred Grassley from Rutgers University, a world-renowned deep-sea biologist, who stated in 2003, quote, "We know that seamounts support large pools of undiscovered species, but we cannot yet predict what is on the unstudied ones. The tragedy is that we may never know how many species become extinct before they are even identified." And we were successful in getting a series of United Nations General Assembly resolutions adopted calling for urgent action to protect these deep sea ecosystems. They still remain to be fully implemented. And in 2016, the European Union adopted deep sea fisheries regulations, which were intended in part to implement the high seas provisions of the UN General Assembly resolutions into EU law for areas in the Northeast Atlantic within EU waters. And again, this has been a very important piece of legislation. It is a major step forward, but it still remains to be fully implemented, and I won't go into the obstacles and challenges there, but there are quite a few. Protecting biodiversity is not just a matter of EU law or UN General Assembly resolutions, but the UN Fish Stocks Agreement, the second of the implementing agreements of the Law of the Sea Convention, has a specific provision in Article 5G, which basically says, in the management of fisheries, on the high seas in this case, and straddling and highly migratory fish stocks, states shall protect biodiversity in the marine environment. And this biodiversity is some of the most vulnerable to anthropogenic stressors. There's slow-growing species in ecosystems, long-lived species in ecosystems. Cold water corals can be thousands of years old. Even some species of fish can be 80 to 200 years old. Some species of shark, the Greenland shark, can be over 400 years old. And they're highly vulnerable to fishing pressure, particularly bottom trawling. And so, is the trawling on these areas ecocide? Well, the definition is quite interesting, I think. It basically, as Susan mentioned, or Sue mentioned, acts committed with knowledge that there is a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage. And in my view, authorizing bottom trawl fishing in areas where there are likely these types of species and ecosystems where they are likely to occur fits that definition of ecocide. And I wouldn't necessarily put the blame on individual fishermen. I was a commercial fisherman for 10 years, including 5 years as a deep sea trawlerman. We would bring up corals, we would bring up glass sponges, some of the most delicate organisms in the ocean and some of the oldest and longest lives. I think one glass sponge in the South China Sea was dated to 11,000 years old, still living. But we didn't know what kind of damage we were causing ecosystem-wide. To me, at least, one of the key players are the states that are actually authorizing this type of fishing. And to the extent that there is liability here, and the extent that the law, ecocide law should apply, in my view, it should apply to the authorities who knowingly authorize this type of fishing and these types of ecosystems, because they're the ones that have the broad overview of how many boats are fishing, how much has been damaged, what's the history of that damage. And again, here off the continental margin of the European Union in the Atlantic, as early as 2002, probably before that, but I recall an article published by Jason Hall Spencer saying you could see the deep sea trawl tracks all along the continental margin of Europe from the UK, which was still a member at the time, all the way down to Portugal. So I think there is a strong case. International law is a powerful tool. The European Parliament resolution from February 2024 endorsing ecocide law is, I think, a very major step forward. But it's going to take constant work and pressure from scientists, from NGOs, from the public to really make international law stick. It's a tool, but it's not necessarily good enough unless we, as members of the public, as stakeholders, basically challenge governments to actually implement the types of commitments and legal obligations that they have. And again, many of you have heard of the Leaders' Pledge to halt and reverse biodiversity by 2030, biodiversity loss, by 2030, signed by all 27, the heads of state of all 27 members of the European Union, as well as Ursula von der Leyen. And let me leave you with the final just kind of thought, and this is from an article published by John Alroy in Science in 2001, talking about the end Pleistocene megafaunal mass extinction event, which was an extinction event caused by the spread of hunter-gatherer societies out of Africa across the rest of the planet. And he called it a geologically instantaneous ecological catastrophe that was too gradual to be perceived by the people who unleashed it. Well, we have ignorance is no longer a luxury that we can afford. We know what we're doing in the deep sea and elsewhere on the planet, to species, to ecosystems, and so forth. E.O. Wilson, in his book, The Diversity of Life, in 1992, said, clearly we are in the midst of one of the great extinction spasms of geological history. And we know from the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Ecosystem Services, on biodiversity and ecosystem services, that 1 million species are at risk of extinction, many in the next few decades from direct exploitation, habitat loss, climate change, and other stressors. So again, I think, in my view, ecosystem law could be a very, very powerful tool to combat this, to challenge this, to reverse this course of action, and to ultimately help halt and reverse biodiversity loss on our planet, in the oceans and elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful. Next up, Farah, a long-time ocean advocate and the founder of the NGO The Ocean and Us, and also the book with the same name, writer of the book. Farah has executed campaigns for various organizations on ocean issues, from destructive fishing, work to affect the communities as well, and on deep-sea mining. For the past 4 years, Farah has been campaigning for a moratorium on deep-sea mining, and I think, Farah, the most relevant question for you would be, how does ecocide fit into the campaign of moratorium on deep sea mining? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Simon, and yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm looking around the room and I'm seeing that there's quite a few young people in the room, which is amazing, which is great, and I feel like I don't need to tell you why deep sea mining is ecocide. But I'm going to do that also for the benefit of the people watching online. And just to make it very clear what we're talking about. So deep sea mining is essentially strip mining the ocean floor to extract minerals. And we're talking at depths of 4 to 6 kilometers deep in areas, as Matt already mentioned. These are areas, the deep ocean is super vulnerable, very slow growing. We have fish several hundred years old, corals several thousand years old, and sponges up to 10,000 or more years old. So, we're talking about destroying environments that will not regenerate in our lifetimes. Now, the technical side of deep sea mining is basically they want to submerge huge machines into the ocean floor, and these will suck up these polymetallic nodules. I mean, there's different types of deep sea mining, but at the moment, the focus is on these polymetallic nodules that sit in an area in the Pacific Ocean called the Clarion-Clipperton Zone. And by sucking up these nodules, they will be destroying the habitat that these nodules actually provide to living beings down there. It will also suck up the top layer of sediment, and all of this will cause huge sediment plumes. Imagine dust storms in areas that see little to no disturbance. There will be light pollution, noise pollution. We know noise travels much faster and can travel further in water than on land. The light pollution, the deep ocean never sees any light. So what we're going to do is change the environment completely with massive light, noise, sediment plumes, and all of this is going to take its toll on life in the deep ocean. And it is not like mining on land, because mining on land, as terrible as it is discrete. In the deep sea, the noise, the light, the sediment plumes will travel far beyond the mining sites. So, and I just want to make very clear also that mining is not needed. Aside from anything else, we do not need to mine the deep sea for the energy transition. We know that there are enough minerals on land, cobalt, nickel, and others. And we also know that battery technology is changing very quickly. And so even 5 years ago, when we were looking, or companies were looking to the deep sea and the metals that that are in these polymetallic nodules, those metals are becoming less desirable for electric vehicle manufacturers and for for the tech sector, as they innovate and find cheaper, alternative, more abundant materials to put into their gadgets and into their cars. Now, I also just want to, coming back to the ecocide, I mean, if we look at the definition of ecocide, Matt just mentioned it as well, but it's basically, it's the acts committed that we know will have widespread or long-term severe damage to the environment. Now, deep sea mining will cause widespread, as I just mentioned. It's going to carry far beyond the areas that are going to be mined, and it's going to be long-term, because that damage, it's unlikely that we will see those marine environments recover on human timescales. The nodules these miners are seeking take millions of years to form. So you could say that deep sea mining is not a renewable, energy source, because we're taking ancient, essential habitat out of the deep ocean, out of where life potentially began. The deep ocean is the cradle of our planet. So to me, there's no doubt in my mind that deep sea mining fits the legal criteria of ecocide. And I think, this is going to be a brilliant development, not just for deep sea mining, but also for all the other activities that we're going to see happen on the high seas. Isabella already talked about it as well. Half the planet is currently ungoverned. Yes, we've got treaties, they're fragmented, as Sue mentioned. We have got this new the Treaty for Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction, which isn't ratified yet, so it hasn't come into force. But what ecocide will do is help create the deterrence for companies and for governments to decide, okay, can we actually go ahead with this? Because there is no enforcement mechanism. And the one key word here is accountability. Everybody here has talked about it, in different ways. If we don't have a mechanism to hold businesses or countries or individuals to account for destroying the very systems that keep us alive, then we really are doomed. And we have to think about a new way of governing not just the ocean, but but everything, the planet, if we are going to live in harmony with nature. And I'll just close with saying that, because I think, Simon, you had wanted me to mention other activities as well, but as sea levels rise, as population grows, as innovation takes off, we are going to be looking to the ocean more and more for everything from food security to, to kelp farming, to shipping, to living potentially on the water, in the water. And so we have to make sure that before we embark on new activities on the high seas, because remember, they belong to all of us, they don't belong to any single nation, we must have a good governance system in place and a good sort of legal mechanism to hold people to account so that they don't destroy that which keeps us alive.
A couple of power speeches already. I'm getting excited here. Last one, Emma Fourreau, newly elected MEP from France, from the left and co-founder of Sang Ocean Instagram account turned association dedicated to raising awareness about the ocean. She's actively involved in ocean conservation campaigns, including efforts to stop shark finning. I would like you to touch a little bit on the aspects that also Isabella talked about, the concept of victims, and specifically of indigenous and affected communities. How do you think the concept of ecocide could help indigenous people and affected communities? Thank you.
Merci beaucoup pour cette question. Je pense effectivement que c'est important d'associer la question des droits des peuples autochtones, parce que ce qu'il faut avoir en tête, c'est que les peuples autochtones sont à la fois les plus impliqués dans la protection des terres, dans la protection de la biodiversité à l'échelle mondiale. C'est aussi les plus exposés à la voracité des entreprises climaticides, mais c'est aussi souvent les plus démunis pour faire face à ces attaques, à ces offensives sur leur territoire et sur leur lieu de vie. Entre 2012 et 2022, on a l'ONG Global Witness qui nous dit que c'est près de 2000 défenseurs du vivant, de l'environnement, qui ont été assassinés à travers le monde. Et la plupart des victimes viennent d'Amérique latine et plus précisément d'Amazonie. Et dans ce décompte macabre, quand on regarde les victimes par an, eh bien, c'est à peu près un tiers qui sont justement des personnes issues des peuples autochtones. Et on estime que les peuples autochtones gèrent environ 38 millions de kilomètres carrés sur la planète. Alors dit comme ça vous évoque peut-être pas grand-chose, mais c'est l'équivalent du continent africain. Donc c'est énorme et c'est une des raisons pour lesquelles il ne faut pas sous-estimer leur rôle dans la préservation des écosystèmes. Et une des autres raisons aussi de s'intéresser aux peuples autochtones, c'est qu'eux n'ont pas brisé souvent ce lien entre les humains et la nature. Ils ont justement des vrais liens d'interdépendance, d'interconnexion à la nature, et ils ne considèrent pas la nature seulement à l'aune des services écosystémiques que la nature leur rend, mais juste en tant que valeur intrinsèque. Ils respectent la nature pour ce qu'elle est. Et donc, cette idée d'harmonie entre l'être humain et la nature, on la retrouve justement chez les peuples autochtones d'Amazonie qui sont confrontés à des appétits prédateurs immenses parce que les multinationales vont considérer que leurs territoires sont des réserves inépuisables en termes de ressources, à la fois minières, forestières, pétrolières. Et je pense qu'on connaît tous, par exemple, le cacique Raoni, qui est une figure justement du combat pour la dignité du peuple Kayopo et contre la mise en place du fameux barrage de Belo Monte. Et ces confrontations en fait, entre peuples autochtones et grande industrie, elles se multiplient partout dans le monde et également en Europe. Je pense par exemple au peuple Sami qui est aussi confronté à l'extractivisme minier qui menace la survie de leurs activités, notamment en ce qui concerne les éleveurs de rennes. Je pense à leur lutte contre le projet de mine de fer à ciel ouvert de Kalak dans le Norrbotten. Je pense aussi à leur inquiétude légitime devant la découverte du plus grand gisement de terres rares qui a été inauguré par Ursula von der Leyen justement pour assumer la transition énergétique. Mais ça pose de grosses questions, notamment pour la survie du peuple Sami qui est évidemment pas consulté quand c'est comme ça. Et donc c'est au détriment de leurs terres ancestrales. Et les peuples Sami, comme les peuples autochtones, partout dans le monde, sont souvent engagés dans des batailles juridiques qui sont interminables, qui sont très complexes, qui demandent de l'expertise, de l'argent. Souvent c'est non concluant, et donc parce que les multinationales ont souvent une longueur d'avance sur ce terrain-là. Et justement, la reconnaissance à l'échelle européenne et internationale d'un crime d'écocide pourrait être l'opportunité de rééquilibrer la balance en instaurant des mécanismes de justice préventive. On obligerait par exemple des juges à évaluer l'impact global d'une activité, d'un projet industriel sur tout un écosystème et son équilibre, et donc en prenant en compte notamment les intérêts des peuples autochtones. Et on peut aussi anticiper que l'inscription du crime d'écocide dans le droit pénal pourrait avoir un effet dissuasif. Les entreprises réfléchiraient peut-être à 2 fois avant de mener un projet écocide, justement par peur d'avoir un procès en écocide. Et je voulais aussi attirer votre attention, mais ça a été évoqué un peu avant, sur un aspect qui est un peu moins documenté du sujet, qui est justement effectivement les pratiques de pêche écocidaire qui peuvent avoir des conséquences dramatiques, à la fois évidemment sur l'océan, mais aussi sur les communautés indigènes qui dépendent des côtes, parce que c'est 27 millions de personnes issues de populations autochtones qui vivent près des côtes. Et pour ces communautés côtières, l'océan, il est vital à la fois pour leur culture, mais aussi tout simplement pour leur survie. Et la consommation mondiale de produits de la mer, qui fait que augmenter, menace justement la survie de ces petits pêcheurs, de ces populations côtières, parce que c'est une pêche commerciale multimilliardaire en fait qui investit leurs eaux. C'est des navires commerciaux qui vont pêcher dans certaines régions de manière évidemment absolument pas durable, qui est une concurrence absolument déloyale pour les pêcheurs côtiers. Je pense par exemple justement à la pêche aux crevettes. Pour que les Européens puissent manger des crevettes, on va aller dévaster les côtes de Madagascar, et ça alimente en fait la famine à Madagascar. Et évidemment, ça met en péril tout simplement les pêcheurs locaux là-bas, qui sont à la fois dans une situation de précarité énorme, mais aussi qui sont en voie de disparition. Donc aujourd'hui, on voit bien que le rapport de force, il est extrêmement déséquilibré. C'est David contre Goliath, c'est les petits pêcheurs locaux contre les grands navires industriels, parfois européens. Et justement, l'introduction de cette reconnaissance de crime d'écocide, on pense que ça peut être un levier quand on l'applique aux écosystèmes marins, justement pour dissuader les grandes industries de la pêche de venir piller les ressources. Et donc c'est aussi un levier de protection des populations autochtones. Et je pense que c'est important de parler d'eux aussi, parce que comme on l'a dit, ils ont peu de leviers, on les méprise beaucoup, on les écoute pas, alors que ce sont ceux qui ont le rapport à la nature le plus respectueux possible. Je pense qu'on a beaucoup à apprendre d'eux, donc c'est important pour moi d'en parler aujourd'hui.
Thank you so much for that. And now I would like to open the floor for interaction between the panelists. Anything that you heard that you found that you really wanted to chime in on or comment or just develop a little bit further? Sure, go ahead.
I just wanted to mention, and I wanted to mention it earlier too, but given what we're talking about, ecocide, and it's going to take a while before that comes into law, comes into effect, and all of this. I'm using the example of deep sea mining because it doesn't yet happen, right? So if we can agree that this is an activity that we're thinking about that we know will cause widespread damage and long-term damage, and we know this before it even begins, then I think it actually is the poster child for ecocide law, because if we can't stop that from happening, it's going to be very difficult, if we can't set that as a precedent of what ecocide is. Other activities are harder to label as ecocide, because we know they're ecocide, many activities we know are ecocide, but some of them it's complicated because there are jobs at stake, because there's infrastructure in place, because there's sovereign rights that we need to consider, all of these things. And I think with deep sea mining, it's kind of a low-hanging fruit, because we're talking about the global commons, our common heritage. It's in the high seas. We're not imposing on any one country. We're not saying to one country what they can and cannot do. We're not taking jobs away. We're not taking infrastructure or investments away. No, we're just saying, hey, the high seas is our golden goose. Let's leave it alone and not begin an ecocidal extractive industry there. So I just wanted to add that to the discussion.
Perhaps a question to you, Sue, on the business side, as you've been working within businesses, and you've also been saying that an ecocide law would not be against businesses necessarily, actually for the businesses that we would like in the future. Could you expand a little bit on that?
Sure. Okay. Excuse me. Yes, in fact, ecocide law is a very positive thing, not just for people, not just for planet, but also for business, because, we've heard it said 1,000 times, there's no business on a dead planet. So it is in business's interest to work in a way that is in harmony with nature rather than in conflict. The key things about it is, at the moment, businesses are being sort of obliged to show more transparency, to move to more sustainable practices. And all that takes investment, it takes time, it takes energy, it takes rethinking systems, but they're doing that. How frustrating for the businesses that are complying to see that there are businesses there that are not complying. So what it does, it will, and they're still outsourcing their costs, their true costs to nature. So in fact, there is a benefit there because it levels the playing field. It also creates certainty. So if everybody's playing by the same rules, then there's an equality there. And we've been talking quite a lot to finance, to the finance industry recently. And they kind of get it because they understand sort of long-term about investments. They understand that actually it is simply, it's a box-ticking exercise in a sense. It's a due diligence procedure. So it's just another thing to think about when you're green-lighting something. And also they see with an ecocide law coming into place, because actually we say at Stop Ecocide International, it's when, not if now. We're very positive about it. But they are thinking about, well, if it is coming in, am I going to green light a 30-year project, given that, we might get an ecocide law in between, or am I going to think about putting my money somewhere else? So in fact, I think it's already making businesses, particularly finance, think about what they're funding at this stage.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think it's absolutely true what you said there. And when we say business, I mean, kind of, in a way, we tend to mean like every business is the same, but of course it's not. And Farah, you mentioned the critical raw materials or the nodules on the deep sea seafloor were very hot a few years ago. But I mean, now things are changing, and also if you're very, very strict and say we're not going to go there, find an alternative, then businesses will. And already we see researchers finding even natrium as one of the minerals instead of lithium in large-scale batteries. Sodium, sorry. Thank you. I have a chemist here, so that's good. No, but I mean, what we as lawmakers say, or what we as a global community say about like what is acceptable and what is not acceptable is actually steering businesses. So that's quite easy thing, and we have lots and lots of examples of that. Once we just legislate, then the businesses find another solution that is not damaging to the environment or to the ocean. When I was young, we always had paper was bleached with chlorine, which then went transformed into dioxin in the sea. And then finally there was a law against that, and then but all the pulp factories, they were saying we don't have any alternative. But then all of a sudden they invented one, like in just a year or so. Then they had another solution. Otherwise we wouldn't have white paper. But they were saying we only can produce brown paper if we're not allowed to use chlorine. But there are always alternatives. So that's one thing I want to say. And also legislation. Okay, so we have corporate laws almost all over the planet where CEOs are demanded to prioritize profit. They have to deliver profit to shareholders. And this is also a huge problem. And I think if we had an ecocide law that would also kind of give some support to CEOs that don't want only to think short term and delivering huge profits, but also needs to calculate the risk of the liability if they are actually committing ecocide while gaining all these profits for their shareholders. So it would be a kind of a support also for all of these businesses that want to behave sustainably. And I've met so many over the years at the World Economic Forum and in other places that, they want to be champions of all the SDGs and environmental laws, but they also see that they are outcompeted by others that don't do it. So it's a problem for them. So this could be a kind of railway that could help them.
Great. Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Simon, and yeah, good comments. Just some additional comments, I think, on this. I would see ecocide law as actually complementing and not being thoroughly kind of challenging international law. It's a step forward that can complement a lot of things that have already been agreed to but have not yet been fully implemented. So, for example, the EU regulation on deep sea fisheries. It's prohibited bottom trawling below 800 meters. Very positive outcome there, although not all bottom trawling below 800 meters, because it's a fisheries regulation when in fact it really is an it's structured as a fisheries, a deep sea fisheries regulation, when in fact it really is an environmental regulation, preventing damage to the environment in the deep sea. And by the way, when we talk about corals and we talk about sponges and so forth in the deep ocean, these are animals. These aren't plants. You know, the scientists talk about sponge fields and coral gardens and this kind of, okay, yeah, it's a sort of a flowery thing down there, but actually these are living animals. And for those who are supportive of animal rights and so forth, this is a serious problem in that regard. But it's the UN resolutions and the EU law is almost a 180-degree paradigm shift in international in regulating fisheries, particularly on the high seas, where the UN resolutions have established that rather than being able to fish anywhere you want except the areas that are closed, it actually establishes you can't fish anywhere. The whole of the high seas is closed until you can demonstrate that you can fish in an area without causing this damage to the deep sea. So it hasn't been fully implemented. There are lots of loopholes and ways that states have figured out a way to get around what they've committed to, but fundamentally this reverses the burden of proof in a very significant way. And again, I would just echo Farah. I mean, the evidence is absolutely clear, the science is absolutely clear that deep sea mining is going to cause widespread irreversible damage. There's a great quote from an editorial piece run in Marine Biodiversity in 2017 by Craig Smith, Stephanie Kaiser, and Pedro Martinez that basically say the nodule-dependent species may take millions of years to recover because the nodules themselves take millions of years to recover, and even the motile sediment infauna, the kind of things, worms and whatnot crawling around in the sediment, may take hundreds of thousands of years to recover from mining impacts. In other words, that's long-term and basically irreversible damage to the marine environment on significant scale, as Farah has mentioned. But again, just coming back to Sue's comment on companies, you know, companies are under pressure, and some of them are doing it voluntarily, to measure their performance against the Paris Agreement targets. And I think increasingly, and this came out through the COP15 of the Convention on Biological Diversity in Montreal, companies will now be expected or being put under some pressure to assess their biodiversity impacts. And that may, I think, and in this case, something like ecocide law, some of these other political commitments can push the private sector in a direction that they wouldn't otherwise go because international and global standards have been established. So again, I think, you know, this is a, you know, to the extent that ecocide law becomes kind of, what would you say, commonplace or recognized and accepted, generally speaking, rather than being still an effort to try to get countries, companies, and international governments, international agencies, and so forth to buy into it, international courts in particular, I think we'll see some real improvement in our impact on the planet.
Thank you so much, Matt. I would like to open up soon the floor for questions from the audience as well. But before that, give the floor to you, Emma, for your reactions.
J'en profite de voir qu'il y a des militants justement de Lookdown sur la question du deep sea mining pour rappeler que c'est important ce qu'on est en train de faire, à savoir bâtir des coalitions très larges sur le sujet justement de la protection de l'océan pour ancrer le fait que l'océan c'est un sujet à part entière dans la protection de l'environnement et du climat parce que c'était pas une évidence il y a quelques années de ça. Et on a vu justement ces dernières années des initiatives de militants écologistes, d'activistes, de personnalités aussi, d'associations, pour justement pousser des sujets précis. Et on voit qu'on gagne du terrain dans la bataille justement des consciences, parce que quand il y avait par exemple la marée noire de la Moko-Cadiz, c'était en 1978 en Bretagne, même si les gens étaient extrêmement choqués qu'il y a eu une mobilisation, eh bien à l'époque c'était un peu une catastrophe qui tombait du ciel, qui n'avait rien à voir avec notre mode de production capitaliste basé sur justement le monde du pétrole. C'était quelque chose comme une catastrophe naturelle qui avait aucun lien avec nos modes de production. Et là aujourd'hui on voit bien qu'il y a une prise de conscience, qu'on fait le lien entre les industries extractivistes pétrolières et les conséquences en termes de dérèglement climatique. Et c'est ce qu'on voit avec le deep sea mining, parce qu'on se rend compte qu'on est en train de détruire à une vitesse folle et qu'en fait, on n'a même pas le temps de découvrir ce qu'on est en train de détruire, qu'on est déjà en train de faire disparaître les espèces et de les détruire. Et donc, c'est important de mobiliser largement autour de l'océan, d'utiliser aussi les réseaux sociaux. On voit que là, il y a des citoyens, des citoyennes qui ne sont pas engagés dans un mouvement en particulier, mais qui relaient les visuels des ONG. Il y a justement cette petite flèche sur la joue qui est devenue un peu un symbole de cette lutte, alors même qu'on pourrait considérer que les grands fonds marins, personne ne connaît, c'est pas très intéressant. Et on voit qu'au contraire, comme l'océan, c'est quand même quelque chose de très précis, qui est un environnement qui émerveille, parce que le climat, ça peut paraître un peu abstrait. L'océan, on voit tout de suite les baleines, les dauphins, enfin, c'est quelque chose de beau, de poétique. Et donc aussi utiliser cette corde sensible chez les gens pour pouvoir toucher leur cœur, toucher leur conscience, expliquer que un océan mort, c'est pas un océan, il est inutile, parce que ce qui compte, c'est toute cette biomasse, tous ces êtres vivants qui le peuplent. Et donc je pense qu'on est aussi en train de gagner une bataille culturelle, et c'est bien de voir que le discours des scientifiques commence à être écouté. Alors, on n'en est pas encore au stade des politiques. Enfin, nous, ça va, mais je pense que la plupart des hommes et femmes politiques aujourd'hui ont une oreille qui écoute un peu plus les industries et le monde de l'argent que les protecteurs de l'environnement. Mais voilà, j'aimerais aussi rendre hommage aujourd'hui à des pionnières scientifiques comme Rachel Carson, Sylvia Earle, Anita Conti, qui sont en fait les sentinelles qui nous ont guidés aussi, qui, avec leurs travaux, nous ont permis de découvrir à la fois l'océan, mais aussi les menaces qui pèsent sur cet océan. Donc on est ici aussi pour poursuivre leur travail. Et c'est important de rappeler qu'il y a aussi des scientifiques femmes, parce qu'on parle beaucoup des scientifiques hommes, mais il y avait aussi beaucoup de femmes engagées et brillantes. Et donc je voulais parler d'elles aujourd'hui.
We now have a little bit of time to engage with you in the audience. I know that we are closing soon, but as we also began a little bit later and the next event is in half an hour, I think we can allow a little bit more time for interaction with you. So if you have a question, raise your hand and I will give you 1 minute for only a question, not a comment, and I'll take 3 and then come back to you in the panel. So we have you first. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the very interesting discussions. I'd like to ask any of you, we are now in a changed political climate, a complicated political climate, with strong forces and including also popular voices going against environmental protection. Even on a topic which would seem as obvious as deep sea mining, we see things coming out, such as what is in the Draghi report, reopening doors that we are hoping to close. So I'd like to ask you, and we talked a little bit about how to bring also the economic side, the business side into this discussion. How do we make this case also to those who are not necessarily environmentalist activists, and who are our allies in this discussion?
Thank you so much. And your name was?
Alice Belin.
And then we have a question down here as well. Please go ahead.
Yes, hello. I'm here representing Lookdown. We were doing an action earlier outside where Emma came to talk. We're supported by Sustainable Ocean Alliance. My question is kind of similar to the one just asked before. We'd like to know, with the Draghi report that came out, what kind of setback does this mean for us? What are the next steps for European countries? We've been protesting for more than 2 years now. We'd like to know, what will be the next steps for the countries that have joined the moratorium? What could they base themselves on? Thank you.
And then I think we had, there, Iris, go ahead.
Thank you very much, and I'll be very short. Iris Ziegler from the German Foundation for Marine Conservation. I just wanted to follow up on what Emma said. ecocide sharks. Is there any plans, or can you envision anything? And I'd really like to hear whoever thinks that could be answered best. Can we see what we are doing to the shark populations globally as ecocides? I mean, they are caught just for the fins, and we are seeing them vanishing from our oceans with effects we can even not imagine yet. Is this something that would qualify as ecocide? Because it has huge impacts. That's what I'd be interested. Thank you.
Cheers. The question on the new configuration in the Parliament and Drogo report, and also the competitiveness agenda. Would you like to respond to that, Isabella?
Yes, I'm very glad that you raised that question. Of course, we're here in a room of very many like-minded people and civil society organizations. But the overarching narrative of the new Commission will be one of competitiveness, and that the EU needs to be at the forefront of let's say, there's security, but also security in terms of making sure we have critical raw materials, energy, food, and more of self-subsistence is one. That is also, I mean, it makes sense in a way in the political situation that we see globally with China and the insecurity with the US and other parts of the world. But we need to make sure that this does not also mean that we will compromise on the Green Deal or on environmental legislation or social sustainability that we must protect as Europeans and the European values. I'm quite worried, actually, what I'm hearing also from the commissioner candidates, where they actually say that the values are important, but sometimes it's difficult to combine with our interests. And that is exactly so, and that also is in connection with our relations with the rest of the world, so the developing countries, for instance. And there's a lot of things in the mission letter for our commissioner designate for international partnerships, about how we must now see eye to eye with developing countries, and not it's a paradigm shift. It's not like poverty eradication anymore. It's more about mutual interests, a lot of mutual interest in the mission letter. And that is also about the EU global gateway, where the EU is paying for infrastructure projects, everything from harbors to roads and things like that. And that is obviously in the competition of China that's doing the same thing. So we're in a very complicated world here. And I'm also very worried about the Draghi report and its mentioning of deep sea mining a number of times. And we have to be very, very careful. And from my part, I was the Minister of Climate and also International Development in Sweden for 7.5 years. And we know that the green transition will mean that we will need more electricity, clean electricity. We will also need, to some extent, more critical raw materials. But we should not repeat our mistakes, and I think from the past on how we have developed. But this time around, we don't have any time to lose. We have to do all this with the consciousness of sustainability in all its dimensions. So I'm, from one, going to work very hard also in the ITRE committee, where I'm also a full member, to try to show that we can do this transition without compromising, without backtracking on environmental and social values and legislation and everything that we have in place. On the contrary, we need to show by example, be real leaders. And I think that's also in our self-interest, talking about self-interest, to show the world that we can do this transition. And if we can do it, or rather if the EU can't do it, then I would say it's going to be very, very difficult to convince the rest of the world of making a real transition that is sustainable. So we have to show with our leadership and how we're going to convince the other groups in the parliament, those two, the patriots and the sovereigns and everyone. That is, I think, a task for all of us to really emphasize, not least the social dimension of the Green Deal and the transition that we need to do. And I think what people that vote for these parties, they are not pro big businesses or big corporation or big everything that destroys the planet or the environment, but they are pro ordinary people. And so we need to really have a narrative where we can explain how this is not in the interest of their voters or their constituencies, but that we have solutions that are socially sustainable and also will protect these people. Because if we destroy the planet, we're not going to provide a secure future for them or their children and grandchildren. Everyone's children and grandchildren, I would say. So we're all in the same boat here now. So I think we must fight to really make that message clear.
Thanks so much. Responding to the question on the next step of the deep sea mining campaign, Farah, would you like to take that?
Yeah, so I think it's also a combination, just adding to what Isabella said. But when we think about this report, and what I think the question was, what can member states that already support a moratorium do in light of this new report? Well, if we everything that Isabella said is absolutely right? The environmental damage, we need to consider the social dimensions and everything else. But we should also make sure that there is an economic justification for destroying the deep sea, right? I mean, that shouldn't be the reason to destroy the deep sea, but at the moment, there isn't even an economic case to go deep sea mining. So what we're basically saying is, let's unleash this irreversible experiment on our one and only habitable planet, and we don't even know that it's actually going to serve us economically. I mean, I'm not a business person, I'm an environmentalist, but if that's the thing that's going to get countries to take this issue seriously, then we should look at the economics. Inflation has changed in the last 5 years or however many. We know that. We all feel it in our pockets. Well, if you look at the projections or the profitability margins or whatever that these aggressive mining companies, deep sea mining companies are putting forward, they are using inflation rates from 5 years ago or however many years ago. And it does not reflect the current price of such an expensive endeavor of going 4 to 6 kilometers deep into the ocean to mine the deep sea. But also, as we've all said earlier, we know that those minerals that they are seeking, the cobalt and the manganese and the nickel, they are at the moment, there's enough supply of them. And that's why the cost of these minerals has actually gone down in the past few years because battery technology is shifting. So if we just take the environmental argument aside and the ecocide argument aside, and that we need the deep ocean for our own survival and a healthy planet for our own survival, let's get those countries that support a moratorium to start emphasizing the economic argument and say, hey, this is not viable economically, and we will not accept unleashing an experiment onto our planet.
Great. Matt, you want to have a short comment on that as well, and then I'm going to give the floor and shock finning to Emma.
I think it might be possible to put the Draghi report in its place. And as some of you may be aware of the European Academies of Science Advisory Council report that came out in 2003, which basically argued that the idea that deep seabed mining is somehow better than terrestrial mining, and B, that the world needs the metals from the deep sea to enable the green energy transition are misleading and in some cases greenwash. And serious thinkers that have looked at this have come to the same conclusion and the types of conclusion that Farah has just mentioned. But there is some good news here, at least. I remember when I started working on deep seabed mining in 2013 rather, together with Ann Dom from Seas at Risk, and Monica Verbeek and others, and more recently now with Simone. But back in 2013, I would hear from the European Commission, deep seabed mining is inevitable. Europe has to get on board. China's going to do it. We all need to get our share of the pie. And we launched together, again with Seas at Risk, and with Farah and others, an effort to call for a moratorium on deep-sea bed mining at the International Seabed Authority, together with Fiji and Palau, the Prime Minister of Fiji and the President of Palau at the United Nations Oceans Conference in 2022. Those two countries came out. Today, 32 countries, including 11 countries in Europe, are now calling for a moratorium. Now, not every one of those countries is entirely firm on this, but all of them recognize that we simply don't know enough about the deep sea, and we're not going to know enough about the deep sea anytime soon to be able to even assess what the risks of deep sea bed mining are, much less whether it can be managed to prevent those risks. That's not enough countries to stop it from happening, but we're building toward a larger number of countries. Most of the deep sea metals are found in international waters. That's where most of the deep sea resides. The International Seabed Authority is negotiating on regulations, but they're also negotiating on how and whether and how they're going to protect the environment from harmful effects of mining. And so we're trying to build and get more EU member countries, as well as countries elsewhere in the world, to come out and say, you know what, the negotiators in the 1970s thought this was a really good idea. They thought the world would get rich off mining the deep ocean in international waters, particularly developing countries. They thought it could be possible to mine without doing damage to the marine environment because nothing really lived down there. Now we know better. And ideally, in anything you all can do to help, and certainly Parliament has been fantastic in terms of adopting resolutions on calling for a moratorium on deep sea bed mining, going back to 2018, I believe it was the first of those resolutions. But anything you all can do to help to get other countries on board on this would be really, really helpful in changing the course of history in terms of the Law of the Sea Convention, away from let's go mining the deep sea because we're going to make a lot of money doing this, to let's protect the deep sea because our future survival needs it. We know that the deep ocean is one of the largest global carbon sinks, and the last thing we want to do is to mess with that because we're going to need all the help we can get from the ocean to survive the next several decades on into the 22nd century.
Here, here. Thank you. And the last word to you.
Merci beaucoup pour la question justement sur les requins. Alors, je ne vais pas donner un avis scientifique parce que je ne le suis pas, mais mon avis à moi, c'est qu'effectivement, on peut parler d'écocide quand on parle de ce qu'on fait aux requins, parce qu'on parle de 50 millions à 100 millions de requins tués par an. C'est énorme. On parle quand même de 90% de la population de requins qui a disparu en 60 ans. Donc, on voit bien l'échelle à laquelle on s'en prend aux requins. L'une des grandes menaces, c'est justement cette pratique du shark finning. Alors, pour ceux qui ne savent pas ce que c'est en fait capturer des requins, uniquement leur couper les ailerons, puis relâcher le requin vivant en mer. Mais évidemment, il coule parce qu'il a besoin de faire fonctionner ses branchies pour pouvoir respirer, mais il ne peut plus nager, donc il coule dans le fond et il se fait dévorer littéralement vivant par d'autres espèces. Tout ça pour avoir ces ailerons qui auraient des vertus aphrodisiaques selon justement certaines traditions asiatiques, et parce que c'est un symbole de richesse. Alors qu'on dit bien que les ailerons de requin n'ont aucun goût, que c'est pas bon, on en fait des soupes, mais que c'est vraiment en fait juste de l'apparence. Donc on voit à quel point on peut considérer qu'une vie animale n'a juste aucune valeur et que certaines croyances sont plus importantes que la vie des animaux. Et justement, l'Union européenne a un rôle à jouer parce que c'est une grande plateforme de transit pour ces ailerons de requin, et c'est pour ça qu'il y a cette initiative citoyenne européenne contre le shark finning qui a atteint plus d'1 million de signatures. Donc là, c'est la Commission qui doit répondre sur ce sujet. Et donc là, on appelle vraiment tout le monde à regarder ce que va nous proposer la Commission. Alors, il y a plusieurs scénarios. Nous, on est évidemment pour le scénario le plus ambitieux pour vraiment mettre fin au commerce d'ailerons de requin. Les indicateurs montrent que ce serait plutôt pour le scénario 2-3, donc quelque chose d'absolument pas ambitieux. Donc c'est important qu'il y ait toujours une pression citoyenne, qu'on ne s'arrête pas au fait qu'on a justement porté cette initiative à 1 million de signatures. Il faut vraiment continuer le combat, parce qu'on le rappelle, les requins, c'est des prédateurs et des super prédateurs qui ont un rôle essentiel dans les écosystèmes marins. S'il n'y a plus de super prédateurs, c'est tout le reste du réseau alimentaire qui s'effondre. Donc c'est vraiment très important de prendre à cœur ce sujet, parce que quand on parle de dauphins, il y a un certain capital sympathie, et quand on parle de requins, tout de suite beaucoup moins, parce qu'on a eu notamment des films qui dépeignaient les requins comme d'horribles animaux. Et au contraire, là, c'est important de rendre leur lettre de noblesse aux requins qui ont le droit de vivre sur cette planète. Ils existent depuis très très longtemps, bien avant l'existence des humains. Donc je pense qu'il faut encore une fois avoir un peu d'humilité et respecter le vivant, et notamment les requins. Et donc je pense que pour répondre à la question, on peut parler d'écocide et que c'est vraiment très important qu'on suive ce dossier. Ce sera mon cas, je pense que ce sera le cas d'Isabella aussi, de nous tous autour de cette table, parce qu'il y a un vrai enjeu pour interdire le commerce des ailerons de requin, ce qui pourrait aussi permettre de diminuer eh bien, tout simplement le fait de les tuer. Et aussi, par exemple, en France, et c'est là qu'on voit qu'on ne respecte pas les requins très rapidement, c'est qu'il y a des espèces de requins comme le requin renard qui sont protégés, mais si c'est issu d'une capture accidentelle, alors on peut quand même les mettre en vente. Et donc, en fait, ça envoie un très mauvais message aux consommateurs qui est, on les protège, mais en fait, on peut quand même les manger. Donc, il faut aussi pousser dans les pays pour qu'on ne puisse pas commercialiser des requins, même si c'est issu de pêche accidentelle. Et on le rappelle, c'est pas du tout de la pêche accidentelle. Quand ça arrive tout le temps, c'est plus un accident. Merci.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. We have really covered a lot of thematics here during this discussion. I'm really happy that we completed this. We will have to cut short now. No more questions, no more intervention from us because the next event is happening in 15 minutes or so. Thank you so much for participating. I hope that this was as interesting for you as it was for me. And thank you also for the panelists.